Everybody, and welcome to the next evening with Media Mondays. This edition is special because my colleague Dr. Moždov managed to secure as a special guest for us Laura Snipes from The Guardian. So he will introduce her, and then it will be floor of her to say something about her work. So please, Miloš.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. Good evening also from my side. I'm really happy to have Laura Snipes here with us in Prague. Short introduction is she's currently at the position of Deputy Music Editor at The Guardian. She has been for years a contributing writer for the Pitchfork as well, and I would say she's been one of the leading voices in music journalism that generally helped to and contributed to make music journalism and music scenes like generally better place.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's a real honour to be here. We've been here since Friday, and it's been really nice to go to Bike Jesus and explore your city, and it's been really wonderful. I'm going to do a little presentation first. I'm 35. I started working professionally as a music journalist in 2010 when I got a job at NME, so I thought it might be interesting and maybe useful to sort of trace some of the changes that I've seen over that time. So I wanted to start with something that happened the other day. This is an interview with Robert Smith from The Cure that appeared in the UK newspaper The Times. And as you can see in the stand first, it calls it a rare interview. The interview starts with the writing, "The first thing you notice about Robert Smith is that uniform of his, wild hair, black clobber, lipsticks, blah, blah, blah." So you get the sense that he's been in the same room as this man. The first quote is Robert Smith, dispelling his image as a goth by saying, "Well, I don't read by candlelight," he says with a grin. And then the writer goes on to say that Smith is glorious company, the personification of light and dark. I met him a few years ago and was struck by his warmth and wit. Back then, blah, 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 blah. Now he has a new record. It takes until the 5th paragraph for him to actually reveal. So it says, "Smith has been teasing a new record for years. It's drifted in and out of my life." He says, in a video interview he recorded for the record label at Abbey Road a few weeks ago. So what the regular reader might not realise based off this journalist hasn't met Robert Smith at all. The record label has produced a video interview with him, which lasts about an hour and 40 minutes, which has been sanctioned by the label. They've said what the questions can and can't be. Robert Smith has agreed to sit down to it. And The Times, a very reputable newspaper, they've been offered this interview, which we were also offered it at The Guardian, and I said, no, we're not going to run this because it's not our interview. But they have made it seem like they actually met him. And that's the actual video, which you can watch the entire thing of online if you want to. Similarly, just before this, Beyoncé was on the cover of American GQ. Beyoncé famously doesn't really do interviews anymore. And they had a whole photo shoot with her. They'd obviously spent a lavish amount of time with her for the amount of photos and different looks and so on that they had. But the interview was not based around new music, the album that she put out earlier this year. It was because she has a new whiskey line that's coming out. And then it turns out that the interview was not done in person, it was done on email, and it's presented as a Q&A. And so obviously she and her team have been able to say yes or no to the questions that have been sent. And I would suspect probably write some of their own as well, because this interview elicits such, paralyzing insights. Says whiskey isn't just for old men in smoky bars, it's for anyone who appreciates depth, complexity, and a bit of mystery, which might as well be words from an advert. But GQ will run it as a cover because Beyoncé is an absolute superstar. People will buy it. It looks good for them that they've been able to command this kind of access, no matter how we might qualify that access. And obviously Robert Smith and Beyoncé are quite different figures, but they can do this because they know that outlets will take it. Once upon a time, magazines, newspapers would have demanded first-hand, time with these people, like an hour in a hotel room, even something like that. But now, they can do this because they know that outlets will take it, because we are kind of starved for access and starved for stars. And because of social media, they can put whatever they want out there. They can tell their own stories. And so there's the perception that you don't need print media in the same way. I think, Robert Smith doesn't have anything particularly controversial in his past that he needs, wants to not talk about. Beyoncé, maybe there are some more controversial things that she doesn't want to be asked about, which is why she does want to set those terms. But, they clearly both see doing interviews with journalists where they haven't set the terms of engagement as some kind of, reasonably important. They're still doing them, but they're still, they don't want to risk actually losing control by, handing the microphone to somebody else. And I would say, yeah, in the 14 years that I've been doing this professionally, this is the biggest change that I've seen. Like, the music press used to have this power of storytelling and mythologizing, which now musicians feel that they have because of social media. And so we have a journalism industry that's happy to take fed pieces like this, which I think fundamentally kind of end up shortchanging all of us, because if musicians know that they can do this and big reputable publications will take them and run them and make it look like they've done it, why would they ever, if you can do one interview, because this interview, Robert Smith says things in it about Ticketmaster, as some of you may have seen, like he had a battle with Ticketmaster over the fees that they added to their ticket prices. He says things in this interview that he has said before, but it meant that they got hundreds. From this one video and the one thing in the Times, they got hundreds of news stories on other websites because then everybody reported what he said. So it's like, great, your artist can do one 90-minute interview, another publication will pick it up and print it, and then you get hundreds of news stories off the back of it. Why try harder? Yeah, but I think, this has happened partially because of social media, also a journalism industry that's happy to function in that way, and maybe also a shift in the cultural fandoms, a fandom in which fans expect kind of blind respect for the artists they love. And so if they ever came across an interview that had anything they thought was critical in it, they would get very angry and the journalists might feel their wrath online. So I was going to go back to 2010, which is, when I first started doing this. Back then, access was definitely starting to slip away. That first year that I worked at NME, we had a very rare David Bowie cover, because I think it was around when the Next Day came out, his sort of comeback album. But then also, at the same time, Liam and Noel Gallagher from Oasis were on the cover multiple times that year. The band had split up the year before. They were not doing any interviews, but there were still covers, covers with them on the front, talking about like the greatest. There it is. Rock's messiest bust-ups. It makes it seem like, one year gone. They're not actually interviewed in it at all. But sales were dropping, and the magazine was struggling to reposition itself as tastes, like, young music fans' tastes were becoming less tribal, less like those Britpop days of old, and pop was becoming a lot more powerful. At the same time as well, because we were struggling for access to people, they were desperately trying to create new stars because the old ones didn't need them anymore, which led to some really desperately embarrassing coverage. I thought this Lana Del Rey thing was an interesting example. So I did this interview, but it wasn't an interview for this issue. I originally interviewed her the day that Blue Jeans came out, which was her second official single, and it was a very weird encounter in this hotel room where she kept asking me if I minded if she smoked, and there was like a shopping channel on the TV showing Disney porcelain princesses being sold. It all felt very set up, and I couldn't tell if she was very naive or if I was being played like a fiddle or somewhere in between the two. But anyway, that interview was for our new music section, which at the time was called Radar, and it was like a 300-word piece in the front of the magazine. And we were able to get that access because we had backed her early on, because Video Games was clearly such a great single. But then by the time her debut album came out, she was such a big deal that she didn't need us anymore. We couldn't get another interview. And so I had to go back to the transcript of the one that I had done to originally write 300 words from and turn it into like a 4-page cover feature or something like that. I think part of it is reprinted as a Q&A, part of it is me remembering my recollections from the day. It's a sorry excuse for a cover. When you're expecting people to pay £2.40 a week for this as well, so they're not getting very good value. Just to talk about how the nuts and bolts of my kind of job and music journalism jobs have changed over time. My job then was assistant reviews editor, which meant I worked on the review section, but I also had to hand type out the gig listings. If you've ever wondered how they get into magazines, they might not exist now, but they were literally hand typed in. But by the time I had done that for a little bit, I could do all of that in about 2.5 days. And in the rest of my free time, I got to work across all the other bits of the magazine, kind of learning the craft of magazines and learning how to do different kinds of writing and stuff, when I was 21, which was really valuable. I worked at NME twice, first for 2 years, then I worked at Pitchfork for a year in between, then I went back to NME a second time. And when I was there a second time as the features editor, the young woman who's doing the job that I used to do, when she finished doing the gig listings in 2.5 days, she just had to write news stories for the internet. There was no sort of investment in somebody as a journalist, or here's how we teach somebody their craft and make them more valuable to the magazine, which was a sad shift. In 2012 I started working at Pitchfork as their only UK member of staff, so I didn't work over there, I worked out of my house. There were some interesting cultural differences. One is that, I don't know how it would work here, but in the UK, say you get sent to a foreign country to do something with a musician, it's the record label that pays for it. But in America, if you get sent to a foreign country to do something with a musician, the publication pays for it because it's seen as less of a conflict of interest. Also, in the UK, we have a pretty storied history of music journalism, like magazines like this, although these ones are on glossy paper. They used to be called inkies because they were printed on newsprint. And it's a bit more, kind of rough and ready, and everybody's kind of like stuck in together, whereas the American school of music journalism comes more out of Rolling Stone and stuff that's a bit more essayistic and like the new journalism, as they call it. It's a lot more formal. I think it was a really interesting year to start working there because I think it's probably the first time that their album of the year was won by a rapper. It was Kendrick Lamar, Good Kid, Mad City. Previous year it had been Bon Iver, number 2 on this list as well as Frank Ocean. And again, I was saying that NME had really struggled and failed to adapt to how music fandom had become a lot less tribal. But I think publications like Pitchfork did a good and well overdue job of recognizing that, it was not legitimate to focus on purely like white indie music being like the most, important thing, and that really the greatest innovations in music were coming from black artists. And that if they wanted to have any sort of future as a publication, both sort of like commercially, but ethically and spiritually, they had to start reflecting that. I think this also goes hand in hand with poptimism, which we're going to talk about later. You start seeing people like Sky Ferreira break through, these sorts of like alternative pop stars that make indie snobs, of which I was definitely one as well at this point. I liked pop as a kid and then got more into indie and then sort of swore off it again until around this point when I was like, oh wait, this is actually really good. Pop music being weighted with as much value as rock music had been. And it's also the beginnings of a long process of better representation among critics and staff. There was I was one of quite a few young women who was working at Pitchfork at this time. They were starting to work with more writers of colour. Today we're still nowhere near parity, but back then it really did kind of feel like the dark ages at points. I think the best illustration of this is that in 2014, when Taylor Swift put out 1989, Pitchfork didn't review that. But a year or so later, when Ryan Adams put out a song-by-song cover of the album, they did review that, which tells you what they thought was kind of more legitimate. A year later, I went back to NME, and at that stage, we were absolutely desperate for cover stars. I think one year we put Arctic Monkeys on the cover 5 or 6 times, and they were not interviewed in all of those. Maybe they were interviewed in about 2 of them. And every year we had something called the NME Awards, where the musicians would turn up. And I was a features editor then, and my boss said, you have to go and tell Arctic Monkeys PR that if they won't talk to us now, we'll never put them on the cover again. And I was like, I think she's going to know that's an empty threat, because we need them a lot more than they need us. And it didn't work. It was a very challenging time to work there. Absolutely, nothing was working. Sales were really, really terrible. Sometimes they were as low as like 12,000 a week. And at the absolute height, pre-internet, it had been 500,000 copies a week. And sadly, putting Liam Gallagher on the cover really, really did sell a lot more issues. But at the same time, the magazine was writing its own eulogy, because that's a very alienating way to, that's a surefire way to alienate anybody who's got a more kind of contemporary, wide taste in music, which was certainly more the norm then. They were also desperately trying some quite futile online innovations. NME had a website for quite a long time, like before most music publications did, but it was very much sort of focused on news and gig listings and stuff like that. At Pitchfork, they had invested a lot of money and time in doing these cover stories. This is one that I did with Bat for Lashes, where they were designed in a way where, as you scrolled, the pictures would move and like the image around the text and stuff would change. And it cost them a lot of money to produce them. But I remember one kind of horrifying meeting at NME where some sort of editorial director thought that we could do them on no budget and also charge readers to read them on an article-by-article basis, almost as if they were putting a coin in a slot machine to be able to read a page of the internet, which is just not how the internet works at all. It got to the point where there was staff protests about the lack of women and people of colour on the cover. I quit in April 2015, and 5 months later, the magazine went from being sold in shops to being handed out in the streets for free. And it became a lot more commercial. They had like controversial DJs, like radio DJs on the cover. There were, and they were also desperate for advertising then as well. There was one kind of infamous cover where the band Foals were on the cover, but it was sponsored by Netflix, which produces BoJack Horseman, and Foals were not told about this, but on the cover they were styled as BoJack Horseman characters. It wasn't even Foals on the cover. Which sort of speaks to the desperate need for advertising to keep a title like that afloat. In 2018, NME killed off its print issue entirely, and the website today is quite good. It sort of repositioned itself as a place where younger writers kind of cut their teeth, and it's very good for news, and it's also now owned by a Singaporean company, and it does a lot of English language K-pop coverage, which is not something that a lot of places do. And that seems like a very smart pivot to have made. But yeah, it's been, I don't know what music media in this part of the world is like, but in the UK it's kind of been a bloodbath since then. In 2020, Q magazine shut down, and that was a really brilliant magazine. They could get good access with people. It was the last kind of place where you might get sent on tour with somebody for 2 or 3 days and like be in their tour bus and, you know, get real access to them. And it had some of the best writers in the business, and it was very funny, but it also struggled for advertising. And I think maybe there's this, you know, weird split between, as I've been saying, so it was very beneficial to a site like Pitchfork to have a much wider remit. But I think that for print publications, they kind of only survive now when they're very specialist. Like online, you know, if you're a fan of Bat Flashes, you could go on Pitchfork and just click on this and ignore all of the rest of it. Whereas if you, you know, you're reading a music magazine that you expect to have more rock coverage or something in it, and you find that it's veering way outside of that, you might feel like your investment is a bit of a waste of money. We'll come, I think, to talk about this, but I think that's kind of what happened with Pitchfork as well. I think they just sort of didn't know how to position the brand to advertisers because they weren't able to see one distinct sort of group using it. After I left NME, I went freelance for 3 years, which I imagine some of you might be making your first forays into freelancing. And it can obviously be very hard from the outside looking in, because publications tend to distribute big interviews among staff and sometimes a small group of writers. You have to get very creative with where to pitch. You also really need to befriend your peers and share share information and get good at schedule management, which is really difficult. And also cultivate relationships with publicists. Like when I worked at NME, I had been a bit dogmatic about thinking that was some kind of compromise of integrity to, you know, fraternize with the people who are the ones who facilitate this access. But it was then that I realized that I'd been kind of short-sighted, and it is kind of all a bit of an ecosystem. And yeah, from 2018, I started working at The Guardian, so now I'm on the other side of that editorial divide. And over the past 7 years, the page counts for our section have shrunk. We have a print section on Fridays called Film and Music, and when I started, it was 24 pages, and now it's 12 pages, and it's half film, half music, so you only have kind of 6 of that. The budgets have shrunk. We've seen lots of members of staff leave, involuntary redundancy cuts, and also that means that we're able to publish far less than we used to because there just isn't the manpower to be able to produce all of the work that we just did. I mean, yeah, even for us, it can still be really, really hard to get access to stars. I had been, going back to that Kia interview, I had been emailing that publicist for more than 2 years trying to make sure that we got the interview when they came back with a new record, and then that was still what happened. And yeah, a lot of artists don't see the point of doing interviews, and if a publicist arranges one that ultimately goes wrong or they think it reflects badly on them, they're going to get fired as well. And also, actually, most of the major labels in the UK have recently fired all of their in-house publicists, which kind of tells you all you need to know about how much they actually value the written word, which is not very much. Sometimes, oh, sorry, that was the false cover. I meant to show you that. Horrible. Sometimes getting an interview, especially with a really big star, can be a massive process of pitching and negotiation that lasts for years. I'd been pitching for a PJ Harvey interview for about 7 years until I got one last year. And in 2019, I interviewed Taylor Swift, and that came after a year of pitching her publicist and going for like 3 or 4 meetings with them. I also met her backstage at a concert. I wrote a pitch for the interview that lasted about 2 pages, and it was only then that I got to actually go and do it. And you know, writing those sorts of pitches when you're making an approach about why you want to interview a star, they're quite careful negotiations because you don't want to cede any editorial control. You certainly can't tell them any of the potentially negative things that you'd want to talk about because they would say no immediately. But you can't make any promises saying, well, we won't talk about these things, because otherwise, what's the point in doing it? And we've definitely walked away from interviews with big stars when the terms wouldn't allow for an honest interview. Lana Del Rey famously hates The Guardian because she was interviewed in the paper 10 or 11 years ago, and she said, I wish I was dead already. And then she went online and said, I didn't say that. And then the journalist put up the audio online, and she definitely does say that. And she's not joking. But Norman fucking Rockwell was our album of the year some years ago, and we always do an interview with the person who wins album of the year, and they said that she would only do it if she had control over we call this furniture, so it's like the picture, the headline, the stand first, any other pull quotes and other pictures that you use. And it was like, ma'am, we are a newspaper. No, we would rather not have it than sort of agree to terms like that. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot less access, but I guess the paradox is that all of stars like this and like Lana Del Rey, they still command the narrative, and that means that, you know, everybody who works for, you know, news organizations dutifully covers them. And it also means that because there's so much traffic that goes to those stories, and that is the priority because that's how websites get advertising and clicks, there's less chance for smaller things to break through that would then potentially become part of that news cycle. I don't think the audience for music journalism is any smaller than it once was, but I do think it's been really drowned out by much bigger stars and the needs for sites to turn ad revenue. All of this obviously sounds quite bleak, and I don't want to bleak anybody out who's thinking of like doing this as a career. But I think the flip side of this is that cultural documentation and contextualization remain as important as they have ever been. I think one of the reasons why I like music the most and why I think it's so powerful is that pretty much of all of the art forms, it is the most direct and quickest expression that anybody can make. Like if you make a song, you can get it online, it might find its audience. Like all of the other art forms, you know, literature, theatre, everything, they require so many more people and so much more infrastructure. But in music, you really can genuinely break through just off your own back. And that's why I think music has always been so powerful for amplifying marginalised voices and communities. I think the fact that music journalism can still cause such massive conversation shows that it is significant, even if some musicians would like to pretend that it isn't. I don't know if anybody here is a fan of Halsey, but just last week, my friend Shad D'Souza reviewed their new record for Pitchfork, and he gave it a 4.8 out of 10. For some reason, this prompted Halsey to get somebody on their team to make this graphic containing selectively edited positive lines from the review, but it was also a real own goal because it just pointed people back towards a really negative review of their record. But I would say, this is Halsey trying to reclaim the narrative. And I would say the fact that musicians are still trying to control the narrative shows how important it still is. But most of the time, they're not actually the most skilled parties at telling their own stories. Hopefully it was people like you who will be.
Okay, thanks for the overview of transformations and several continual identity crises of music journalism from over the last decade and more. And so the pending question here is it still desirable job to do, music journalism? I guess you sort of covered it, but...
I am extremely lucky. I have a full-time job in music journalism, and they're pretty few and far between. On the absolute worst day, you're caught by surprise by some breaking news story, and it's a bit stressful. But fundamentally, I get to think about pop music all the time. I work in a newspaper where people in the newsroom just across the corridor are having to think about war and death and politics and stuff like that. We write about pop stars. It's still a great job, and it would be very hard to complain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And would you say, and also from the overview, that there are more requirements for someone being a music journalist right now, that you have to accumulate roles and skills and you have to do more things at once than you used to do, for instance, at 2010? I mean, you mentioned scheduling, context, social, like being in some networks and so on.
It's tricky because I think there's definitely an argument for, especially for younger writers, to be very kind of like multimedia savvy, and I am in my mid-30s, and so I have a TikTok because I sometimes have to look at it for research and stuff, but that's not a medium that I'm using because it's not one that's natural to me. But also that is a place where loads of young people are consuming music journalism. It may be their only exposure to it because perhaps they've never lived in a time where there's been a viable kind of print music press or something. And you look at the success of people like Marg.mp3 or the Needle Drop and stuff, like those formats, it's probably, if you want to be a music journalist now, very wise to learn formats like that. But I think fundamentally the tenets are still the same, like criticism, reporting, interviews, analysis, and then I guess depending on what mediums you want to do that in.
And could you maybe take us or tell us your story, how you became music journalist, and what was desirable for you at that job at the time you were considering this career?
I'm very lucky that I've always pretty much known what I wanted to do. I was a big pop fan as a little kid, and so I started reading pop magazines for children and then graduated into the more teenage ones and then NME. And at some point when I was 13, 14, realised somebody's job to make this and to write these things. How do I get to do that? I've never wanted to be a musician or anything myself, but I just was very obsessed with music and I loved reading these magazines, and it seemed like the absolute best job in the world. And I grew up in the far southwest of the UK, in the tip, and 300 miles away from London, and I did not know any journalists. None of my family work in media or anything like that. But we were really lucky to have a very good local newspaper with a big culture section in the middle, and it was all run by this one guy, and I just used to hound him with emails saying, can I do this for you, can I do this for you, can I do this for you? And one day he rang me and he's like, right, I'm going on holiday next week, you can do the interview this week, which was the first thing that I got published, which was very exciting. And so then I wrote reviews and stuff for him, and then did like a BBC work placement locally and a week at NME when I was 17, and then they asked me to start writing reviews for them. And I started doing a degree in journalism, but I quit after 5 weeks because it just wasn't really for me. So then I went back to university a year later to do French and German. But I would say I spent a lot less time in the classroom than in the student newspaper office, doing stuff, writing stuff to do with music. And then this job at NME came up, so I applied and I quit university to go and work there.
Ah, okay. And what was the first interview you did for the regional newspaper, if you can disclose?
They're called 13 Senses. They sort of lasted like 1 or 2 albums. They were sort of like the next Coldplay, and they had like a little bit of success, but they were not the next Coldplay.
We spoke about, and I guess it's also the motivation for this talk, the sort of music journalism crisis or cultural journalism crisis. There was this one event in January this year when they announced the Condé Nast, the publishing house of New Yorker and Pitchfork as well, that they are sort of transforming Pitchfork. How do you read what happened at Pitchfork, and could you briefly summarize it for us?
Yeah, so in January, Condé Nast, which also publishes like Vogue and all these like big glossy magazines, and they bought Pitchfork in 2016, 17, something like that. And it had always been an independent publication, started in the mid-90s by this guy in his basement in Chicago. But yeah, in January they said that Pitchfork was being folded into GQ, which is technically a men's sort of like culture and lifestyle magazine. There was no further information on what that actually meant. A lot of staff who had been there up to like 20 years lost their jobs immediately. Half the staff pretty much went. It seemed as though the website was going to be shut down and they would just be publishing like music things on GQ. I think the fact that it was being moved into technically a men's magazine as well also got a lot of people's backs up, because when Pitchfork was originally bought by Condé Nast in whatever year it was, the head of blah, 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 business, whatever at Condé said that Pitchfork had an attractive readership of passionate millennial males and its many female and non-binary readers and staff who, as I said, like sort of transformed what the face of the publication was, obviously outraged at the idea that Pitchfork was just seen as like a men's thing. And so it being folded into GQ just sort of seemed to amplify that. And I think there was a long period of uncertainty because even the staff didn't know what was happening for a while. And I think they were rudderless. And also it sounded like GQ were really taken by surprise by this. And they almost seemed embarrassed that it had been foisted upon them when it was not something that they had asked for. But gradually it has found some direction. In September or so, maybe August, they hired a new editor who's a guy called Mano. And he started this really pretty niche blog called No Bells, which is really good. I'm not actually sure if that's still publishing, to be honest with you. But very, very fringe kind of thing. And now he's the new editor, and the website has been noticeably a lot more fringe since then. They're still covering big stuff, but like his first project was a list of the best songs of the past 5 years, which is a bit obviously clickbaity, but it was kind of quite a clever piece of like editorial repositioning because there was some far out weird stuff in there. I hadn't heard of a lot of what was in there, and it was kind of his mission statement of saying like, this is what we're doing now. And I find it very interesting that it's gone that way. Yeah, I think one of my analyses of why Pitchfork got taken under the GQ wing in the first place is that because it was so diffuse, it was hard to attract advertisers because there was not passionate millennial males to advertise to. It's a website that spoke to a lot of people, and so advertisers are probably like, well, like, what do we do with this? Who are we pitching to here? And putting it back under the auspices of a men's magazine might have made it a bit of an easier sell to advertisers. That's what I reckon probably happened. But I think it's very interesting now. And also I'd heard that one of the problems was if Pitchfork gave somebody a negative review, it made it hard for other publications within Condé Nast to get access to them for interviews, etc. And also that sometimes publications like Pitchfork and GQ would sometimes be competing for the same people, and so one or the other of them was losing out. So it needed some sort of repositioning. Obviously, it's absolutely horrible that happened in a way where loads of people lost their jobs completely out of the blue. But yeah, it's very interesting that it does seem to be a lot more niche now. And that seems like a real way of pulling it away from what GQ are trying to do. So they're in very, very separate lanes. I wonder how long it will last, that they're able to keep doing that, what it will mean for the traffic and so on. I think I certainly found this when I worked at NME when we were part of Time Inc. when you're sort of like the young brand within a company and you have a lot of digital native readers and you have sort of like a young and nimble staff, you're quite often used as like the canary in the coal mine, the guinea pig to try out ideas, because if it works for a publication like that, then maybe it's something they can upscale to one of the more like legacy or older things. And my impression is that's probably what they're doing with Pitchfork as well. But yeah, it would be great if it gets to continue in this sort of slightly more kind of like niche way, but we'll see.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like an experiment, because it's quite the opposite that they announced in January that there's a downfall in revenues and so on and so on, and now they are like covering like really niche digital digicore music. Yeah. So yeah. But it wasn't only Pitchfork, but also there were some serious cuts and layoffs in Bandcamp Daily, NPR, and other like bigger music journalists or music outlets. How does all these transformations or like explosions in the field affect your work? You mentioned that there's shrinking of pages. But are there any others? I mean, like in terms of editorial choices or?
I guess, yeah, we have dealt with shrinking page counts and budgets and less manpower. It's really sad that all these publications are shut down, and there's been even more recently in the UK, because it leads to a much less fertile and diverse kind of music journalism scene. My boss, the music editor, is called Ben Beaumont-Thomas, and I guess we're very lucky in that we kind of get to operate like a mini music magazine within the confines of a newspaper, and we're very conscious of the huge privilege the privilege that is being one of the most visible music publications, even though we're a sliver in the world, kind of, because we are on a very well-read news website. We do not have a paywall, unlike the New York Times and other places. And so we've got like a good Venn diagram of overlap, but he likes a lot of metal, which I'm not so into. Like we both like a lot of quite like weird stuff, and we try to make sure that we're covering everything from like Sabrina Carpenter to Oliver Coates to Billy Woods, something like that. Aware that like we want to get this in front of people who might otherwise have once got it from a music press that doesn't quite exist in the same way anymore.
And what position does music section have, like inside the cultural section, if you can say? I mean, if it's comparable, whether music journalism has much more space than film coverage or film reporting, or the opposite? Or you said that in the weekend section there's music and film, right? Our print section is called Film and Music. I do not know what people's individual budgets are. We have about the same amount of print space as film. I think TV has a lot more, just because they have daily reviews, because there's TV listings in every day's paper, and also I suspect they are much better read than us, because TV is very popular. Because we have this. We run stuff online every day of the week, within the confines of our budget, and then we have our proper print section on a Friday. But then, if there's a big music news story, like Quincy Jones died this morning, so that will be our coverage of that will be in the main paper somewhere tomorrow. There will probably be a spread of like the news story, a tribute piece, reactions, or his top 10 songs that he's ever worked on, or something like that. Other times where there's like a kind of cultural, like a musical phenomenon happening that would make sense. Where it would be good to make sense of that for the readers who might not be quite so tapped into deep music, nerdy kind of coverage. For example, I think the last one of these I did when Chapel Rowan, I think her album finally went to #1 in the UK after climbing for a whole year. So I did a report for the Saturday paper, which was like, who is Chapel Rowan? Where has she come from? What does it all mean? That sort of thing. So because it's a newspaper, it's reactive. So when there's call for it, then there's more spaces made. Mm-hmm. And how did you survive Brat Summer in mainstream newspaper? And it was not only Charlie XCX, but also Sabrina Carpenter, Taylor Swift. It was quite big year for pop albums, I guess, like this, like mainstream.
It was absolutely great to have such an enormous changing of the guard at the top of pop music. Like, obviously Taylor Swift is still the biggest thing in the world, and the Eras tour continues. I think it finishes in a few weeks finally, but it was so nice to have a fresh crop of pop stars to write about. Obviously Charlie XCX has been around for a really long time, so is Sabrina Carpenter, but more of like in a Disney realm that I had not heard of her before a couple of years ago. Chapel Rowan, she'd had one go round where I hadn't heard of her, but it was just so nice to have a whole new cast of characters to write about, and then for all to be really different from each other. But the thing that they have in common is they are really fun, and they're very like performative. Like we'd gone through, especially post-pandemic, this phase of having these like bedroom pop stars, or like even before that, somebody like Billie Eilish who comes out of that like bedroom musician thing, where it's quite small and quite sad and quite confined. And it was interesting when a lot of it, especially post-pandemic, when a lot of those people started performing for the first time, they were not set up for it because that's not sort of the arena in which their music had thrived. But then to suddenly have these three wildly extroverted, heavily costumed, you know, very aestheticized pop stars was brilliant. It was so much fun. Yeah.
You mentioned to me that you also have an experience of running Taylor Swift newsletter for almost 6 months. So how was it? I mean, has it shifted your perspective of music journalism somehow, or could you maybe lead us or guide us through that experience?
Yeah, so in February this year, Taylor Swift was absolutely inescapable because her boyfriend's football team was in the Super Bowl, leading a lot of people like me to learn anything about American football for the first time. She had the Tortured Poets Club album coming out. It was also the Grammys where she won a bunch of awards. She was absolutely everywhere. And you know, newsletters, as I'm sure you all know, have been getting bigger and bigger over the past few years. And The Guardian has loads of different ones, like sport one, film one, that kind of thing. We'd never done a music one, and I thought there's a really interesting opportunity here to start a specific Taylor Swift newsletter that gathers together all of our coverage of her, because that was the thing at that point. We're not just writing about her on the music desk. They're writing about her on the business desk, the politics desk, because of how she intersects with American politics. Fashion are writing about her. There's no part of the newspaper, not even the sports section at this point, that we're not doing something on her. When I pitched it to the editor, I was like, it feels more like reporting on the affairs of a small country than like a pop star at this point. Like when the Eras tour comes through your city, it affects like the GDP of your town and hotel bookings and restaurant spend and all that kind of thing. So I thought it was a good place to gather together all of our different kinds of coverage about her, but also with a pop star who's that big, it's very easy for otherwise sensible people and reporters to slightly lose their heads about it a bit and just be kind of swept up in the phenomenon. And maybe we did a little bit of this, a lot of other places did it a lot worse, for there to be a lot of really credulous coverage where you're like, this is demonstrably untrue, or this is a massive inflation of the actual state of affairs. And I just felt like you would read criticism of her music, but there wasn't that much sort of criticism of her. She's sort of more like Disney or Marvel at this point than she is a pop star, because it's this like whole ecosystem. And in the same way that you would have somebody analysing the business affairs of Disney and stuff like that, I thought there was probably quite a good opportunity to try and zoom out from the specificities of the news agenda, or whatever she had worn that week, or who she went to the Super Bowl with, and do something a bit more kind of widescreen. So it was, I thought there was a good opportunity there, and it was a good challenge for me. Yeah, it ran for 6 months. I had 1 month off because I was on sabbatical, but it was mostly fun to do. There was definitely some weeks where I'd be like, I do not know what I'm going to write about this week. But yeah, there was usually something new that was happening. By the end of it, I was very happy to stop doing it, because I would say that I am a fan, and I've been to the Eras tour and I like a lot of her music, but the more close up I looked at the enterprise, the more I felt it was kind of disgusting, and the fans were the best thing about it. I think it is very financially exploitative, and I have lots of other issues with it. And yeah, my takeaway at the end was that I wanted to use whatever time and energy I had, because I can sort of write about whatever I want because I'm on staff, that I wanted to use that time and energy to write about slightly smaller things, people who are not billionaire pop stars with very famous sports star boyfriends. And then, my takeaway of the coverage around her is it's ridiculous. It's asinine. And also a lot of what is written about her is demonstrably untrue. Weirdly, there was a bit at the end of the newsletter where I tried to gather together the most interesting other writing about her, not on The Guardian, just from around the internet that week. And you kept seeing all of these stories about how she had uplifted the GDP of whatever city the Eras tour had been in, but the Financial Times did really incredible, consistent reporting proving that wasn't true. But you don't see anybody actually covering what they were saying, because it's much more fun to be like, whoa, Taylor Swift fever hits Liverpool, that kind of thing.
And you said that you discovered some disgusting things, or when you were closely examining the industrial part of Taylor Swift's enterprise. So can you mention some of them? Because I mean, critical thinking about cultural industries is something we are also trying to do at the institute, so it might be inspirational for us as well. So.
I mean, it was all stuff that was public. It's like her private jet use. Like, I appreciate she's got security issues, but there was somebody who was tracking her private jet use, which she then tried to sue because flight records are just like public. And she would take them for like 30 minutes between places where it's like, this is not contributing to your tour. This is just some social thing or whatever that you're doing. So yeah, the private jet use, the way that she puts out, I think at last count for the Tortured Poets department, her album that came out this year, there are more than 30 physical vinyl copies of it. And she's got very loyal fans. And a vinyl record, it costs 30 euros, 35 euros, something like that. I'm not sure what the conversion is. And when you've got very loyal young fans, and each one of these comes with one different song, which you can only get if you buy the vinyl. It's not on Spotify or something like that. It's gouging young fans who are blindly devotional and don't have a lot of money. And then one of the other reasons that she also kept dropping digital exclusives, or it was like the album repackaged with some new demos tacked onto the end, is because she seemingly could not bear losing her spot at #1 in America. And also in the UK, Brat, to come back to it, was on course to be the UK's #1 album the week of release, and I think Tortured Poets had been #1 for ages before that. And about 2 days before the charts came in, Brat was going to win it, and then I think 6 hours before the eligibility window shut for sales that week, Taylor Swift or her team, whatever, put out a new digital exclusive with some like crap demos on the end, and it worked. And she blocked Charlie from getting #1. And she also did it to Billie Eilish. I think that was with an album as well. And you just think, you are 34 years old. You are the biggest pop star in the world. Like, why can't you get these women who are like Charlie, not so much, but like Billie Eilish is practically a child. Like, let somebody else have your moment. Like, what are you so scared of losing? And yeah, I don't know. I just found it a bit gross and unnecessary.
Just a short notice, we will continue with the interview for a bit, and then we will also create a space for Q&As at the end, so you will have an opportunity to ask Laura as well. I guess with Taylor Swift, it's a good entry point to jump to the issue of poptimism and how it changed and transformed the music journalism. Could you maybe tell us what is your idea of poptimism, or what poptimism is, and also, yeah, we can talk about like contributions and also some negative consequences of poptimism and how it affected the environment.
I think it's from the early 2000s. There's a piece in the New York Times by a writer called Nitsuo Bibi, and it's called The Rap Against Rockism, and it's him taking the music journalism industry to task over its canonization of like male proper rock music, the sort of thing you would once have seen in like a Rolling Stone list of the greatest 500 albums ever, which has maybe got like 2 rap albums and 3 by women in it or something. Him pointing out the limitations of that and saying that all of these other genres of music, which have not typically historically been so respected, are worthy of exactly the same level of like critical analysis and being put on the same pedestals and stuff. And that, I think it was quite a long tail for that article. Like, it's not something that changed things immediately. I really think it's sort of more around the early 2010s. Pop suddenly starts getting written about with the same kind of gravitas as rock had been. I'm trying to think, where would have been first to lead the charge on that. But I remember there was a really good Pitchfork piece called A New Pop by Carrie Batan, and that's about people like Sky Ferreira and maybe Solange when she was in her kind of Dev Hynes era. This idea of like, there are pop stars who are not coming out of the Britney Spears, Katy Perry kind of mold, where it feels like a major label kind of corporate thing, but like young artists who are also like taking a no tourist sort of like approach to pop, which I think, that's how we end up with people like Billie Eilish and Chappell Rowan and Charlie XCX and so on. I think Charlie's really pivotal to this as well, actually, like being like a little club kid who breaks out with all these like mad goth mixtapes and stuff like that. And so, along with the shifting of the guard, in terms of the people who are writing about music and staffing these publications, people who have perhaps like grown up on pop music and maybe like me had a phase in your teens where you're like, actually this is really embarrassing, and maybe to like seem cool at the record shop or around like these boys I know, I should just really like, it's just indie from now on, it's just rock, I don't like pop music anymore. And then, you kind of come back around years later and think, oh, this is actually really good, like why have I been denying myself this? I think, a lot of people were having that kind of moment at the same time, and realising that there's enormous craft in pop music, and you don't have to be a notorious pop star for, you know, to write your own songs for them to be sort of regarded in that way. You know, it could be, I'm trying to think of a good example, but, you know, a Katy Perry album like Teenage Dream, perhaps, you know, that's still regarded as a generational classic, even though, you know, I'm not quite sure of her participation in each song beyond singing them. So yeah, it definitely, it widens the field of what is taken seriously. I think it also, that kind of like platforming of pop really queers music journalism as well in a really important and exciting way. Just because, you know, pop stars have got such huge gay fan bases, and I think that was sort of like recognised and respected in a way that perhaps it hadn't been before. So yeah, it definitely changed things in a really positive way. And, you know, eventually Pitchfork did review 1989 years later when they did a day where they reviewed all the Taylor Swift albums that they hadn't done before. But I think, yeah, I'm still mostly all for it, but I think the thing that curdled poptimism is sort of like the rise of stan culture, where fandoms, you know, music fandom used to be more sort of like tribal, you know, it was more like genre-based, whereas now it's like these loyal armies to just a single figure or pop star or something like that. And they are powerful, and they have been massively respected culturally and socially in recent years. But also they're so sort of like vocal online and so deferential to the artists they love and will attack anybody who doesn't love them, that I think it's made a lot of coverage of pop stars kind of like blind boosterism, because they don't want to anger these people. And also it's probably quite a good way to get traffic. Because they will come after you online if you slag their favourite artist off, I think it's also made some, definitely not all, but I definitely know that some, especially younger writers who are not sort of, you know, don't have like a horrible, tough, thick rhino skin, scared to write negative criticism of pop stars because, I mean, at their absolute worst, like a friend who used to work at Pitchfork got doxxed for giving Taylor Swift's Folklore a medium review, just not a glowing review. Like her address was put online, her phone number was put online, like the firm had to invest in like personal security for her. That's extreme, but yeah, there's a lot of lower level stuff that can happen too.
So on one side it helped to, previously quite sometimes toxic environment to make it better and like nicer place, but on the other hand it created like sort of toxic niches between or among fandoms as well. Yeah. And also on one hand it probably widened our horizons and also widened terms of what can be taken seriously in pop, but on the other hand it also helped to create a sort of monoculture in mainstream cultural section. Would you say that in terms of that everybody's writing only about big pop stars and they don't have, when their pages are shrinking, they don't have space to cover smaller acts? Would you say that, or?
Yeah, I think that can definitely be true. You know, if you've got limited manpower because you've had to lay off a lot of people, and say that you could physically only get 5 articles up that day, and you're depending on advertising, you need the ones that are going to pull in the highest numbers, not, you know, the fringe stuff, which is probably not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the experience of writing the Taylor Swift newsletter made you write more about review things like Godspeed You Black Emperor and Oliver Coates.
Yeah, which I'm very lucky to be able to do because I am employed and I can do with my time, you know, once I've done the things I have to do, the rest of it I can kind of do what I want, and it feels... you know, that Oliver Coates piece that I did the other day, he's the a really, really good experimental composer, and he did the soundtrack to After Sun, which people might be familiar with. I think that got 14,000 clicks. Like, that's not very much at all. By comparison, that week's cover feature, which was a bit unusual for us, got 648,000 clicks. So it's like a drop in the ocean compared. And, you know, yeah, we can see all of these stats. We can see where people are coming to the articles from. Our bosses can see the stats, you know.
Mm-hmm. 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 We have touched a bit a topic of or issue of negative criticism and the backlash from several sides. You had also several like big exposure moments during your career, and you have also some experiences with being attacked by musicians, right? And there was this one particular article we discussed before about Mark Kozelek in 2015, which was then quoted by Matt Healy from 1975 during the ceremony at Brit Awards. Could you maybe say how important was that moment for your career?
It's weird because, just give a tiny bit of backstory, Mark Kozelek he used to perform as Sun Kill Moon, and he didn't do a lot of interviews. I was a very, very big long-term fan, and he said he would do an interview by email, and then when the answers came back, they were very insulting. It was sent back by the publicist. They were very insulting. So I wrote up the piece as best I could, including the nature of his replies. And then he was playing a show in London that week, which originally I'd planned to go to, but then I didn't because I was upset by the answers. And then on stage at the gig, he sang, which was to like 2,000 people, he sang that I wanted to fuck him and have his babies. And I heard audio of it, and like people laugh, and he does it several times. The piece had not yet been published, so I was able to say to my editor, I need to rewrite this and get it in there. And then, it came out, and like I had the last word, and it was sort of vindicating, but it was also horrible. And then I think, then I referenced that piece in something that I wrote about Ryan Adams when he was accused of sexual abuse in an expose by the New York Times. And then Matt Healy read a bit of that out at the Brit Awards. It was sort of like, also we were covering the Brit Awards at the same time in the office. Like I was literally typing out his speech as he then said my name, and it was just a bit like, what is happening? So it was exciting and weird for a bit, but then I had to talk about it a lot in like media stuff, and the thing that I found really depressing was that it was very nice of him to use his platform to sort of make this point about like misogyny in the music industry, but nobody really wanted to talk about that. It was more just like, oh, isn't it exciting that like a famous pop star read your work? And it's like, well, that's not really the point. What did it do for my career? It probably, I already worked at The Guardian. It was very visible. It probably did something for it. I did not enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. We have been talking about the nicheification of music journalist outlets. And do you think that it can be the third way after like rockism, poptimism, and is there something on the horizon? Do you see something there for the future? Because our working title for the talk was Future of Music Journalism, right? So we can kickstart the crystal ball.
Yeah, I think it would be great to see publications getting more niche and understanding that like that's how you survive, like doing something generalist at this moment. If you're doing the same thing as everybody else, you do not have a distinct editorial voice, and so why would people come to your website over another one? A lot of those Pitchfork staff who were laid off earlier in the year have just started a new website called Hearing Things, which I think looks quite promising, and they're not doing things in a traditional formatted way of like reviews with star ratings and stuff like that. It feels a bit more playful and personal, and it would be great to see some more of that coming back into music journalism, some sort of like shoots coming up through the cracks. I feel like it should be down to places like us and other sort of more mainstream music sections, or like in the section of Respect, to cover the sort of like the bigger kind of ticket stuff. But I think if you're a music publication, the only way to survive at this point is to be very specific. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And can you mention some music writing that is thriving at the moment right now, and to be more positive for the wrap-up?
There's some really, really analytical things that I've really enjoyed recently. There's a great writer called Chal Ravens, and she wrote, did you read it, this piece for The Quietus about like the academicization, if that's a word, of the dance floor, and looking at why in the English language, like 4 or 5 or 6 very academic books about like the politics of the dance floor have come out in the past few years, and she's written this really interesting piece being like, why now? And are people more interested in writing about dancing than actually doing the dancing? It's very long, and I won't do it justice by trying to praise it, but it was hyper specific, but really, really, really good. I should say also she has a podcast with her friend Tom Lees. It's called No Tags, and it's super specific. Like they did a 2-3 hour 2-parter on baile funk, and it was just so good. And what else have I liked? Like another really in-depth one, which is like this really appeals to nerds. It's not sort of like a mainstream thing particularly, but Glastonbury in the past few years since the pandemic has been really blighted by overcrowding, and this year it was genuinely scary. It was like crowd crushes, stages had to be stopped. It felt horrible. And Gabriel Zatan, who's the editor of Resident Advisor, I think he's been going to Glastonbury almost every year since he was a baby. He's got the sort of family who always went. He wrote this really fantastic analytical piece about where they were going wrong, what it meant about, what they misunderstood about the desires of their audience and how their audience was both getting younger and older at the same time. Also about, the dynamics of crowds and crowd control and security and stuff like that. So, I have personally enjoyed these hyper-specific sort of analytical things. But then also, like far away from that, one of my favourite covers we had recently was with the musician Paul Heaton, who was the songwriter in the Beautiful South. A guy in his 50s, maybe 60s, something like that. He's like a low-key national treasure in the UK because he's just like a very good guy and his songs are very beloved to a lot of people. But, post-pandemic, it's really common that loads of interviews are just done on Zoom and you really don't meet people as much anymore. But we sent one of our kind of like best interviewers, Simon Hattonstone, to interview him, and they spend 5 hours going between about 3 pubs, and they get so drunk by the end that they can't remember the titles of his songs. But it's just this really lovely encounter with somebody where you get a real sense of what it's like to go to the pub with him and why people love him so much. And it was a real testament to access, like meeting somebody in real life, not describing a video that somebody else has made and making it seem like you were in the room.
So more close encounter reporting, more niche tastes in music that, maybe probably takes readers somewhere outside of what you can read in like mainstream publications, right? Okay, thanks. I guess we can now give some floor to the questions from the audience. So it's not only us talking about music. So are there any questions? We have microphone here as well.
Well, thank you for the talk. It was really inspiring. Well, I don't have a smart question, I guess, but I'm really interested in the way how you manage to stay in touch with the new music, because it seems to be like really more and more overwhelming, the streams of new music like every day, and the possibilities, the number of channels where you can focus on the new music and catch new trends. So, what is your digest?
Very good question. I always have more tabs open on my computer than I can actually get through. Like, I get emailed a lot of stuff, and so I try to listen to what I'm interested in or what might be interesting. And I probably read the same websites as everybody else. But then the best music recommendations seem to come from if I read about an artist that I really like. Anytime they mention somebody and I don't know who it is, I will check them out, because I think that's a really productive way to discover music. At the end of this week, I'm going to a music festival in Utrecht called IKSŽ, and they have different curators. And so it's like artists you love, picking artists they love, which I think is a great way to discover stuff, which you might be to your sensibility. Also, something that I started recently, which I would really recommend if you don't have one, is if you use WhatsApp or whatever thing you use for group chats, having a music group with friends. And even if it's not like your closest friends you talk to all the time, just like ask around your mates and acquaintances, like, who wants to join one of these? Like, sometimes ours is quite a week, and then sometimes you just get like 10 recommendations in one go and everybody has a chat. But I've discovered loads of stuff through there. It's a nice way to do it, and it's sort of away from the noise of the internet where, like you say, it is super overwhelming and you can't listen to everything.
You described kind of the crisis that current music journalism is in. I was wondering if that has something to do with the proliferation of the opportunities that the internet offers people. Like you mentioned, the needle drop, people like that just broadcast themselves as YouTube tells them to, and also other rating platforms like Radio Music and that kind of stuff, where it seems to be more of a democratic thing where everybody can chip in, and we got this thing that seems to be more representative of the general population than just some journalists writing their opinion on something. Is that like a factor in the decline, or?
I think almost definitely, and I think that all of those things are also really positive. Like, it's great to have people like the Needle Drop, because also he is a lot of people's only interaction with sort of like music criticism and that kind of contextualization. Obviously, there's stuff like, Metacritic can rate your music, but I would say that they sort of like smooth out an average, and I think that the value in quote unquote proper or like, long form written music criticism is, you don't need it. You can just go on Spotify and listen to something. When I was a teenager, I had to like save up my money and then buy a CD, and if it was bad, then sucks for you. But because you can just listen to it yourself now, you don't need somebody to just basically tell you, is this bad, is this good? But the value of it is, analysis, then making connections that you might not have thought about before, situating it in kind of like a wider context, both in terms of like, culturally and potentially socially as well. So I do think that those things have probably had an impact, but I also think that they've only sort of amplified the importance of what long written criticism can do that those formats can't really do.
Hi, thank you for coming to Prague. I have two questions for you. The first one is, since we have been talking about like the shrinking of culture, just like sections of culture sections in like big like large media groups, and so I wondered if you feel somehow like a privileged person in this certain type of having a full-time job in something like Guardian is, and if this doesn't, if this does bring some types of like existential, I don't know if crisis is the right term, but like maybe concerns about your like future, like about your future careers. Like I know that you are actually like you are really like your proposition is like kind of good, and but if this like if this shrinking like is happening everywhere, needs these concerns. So this is the first question, and the second is if you can share some, I don't know, funny or nice story from some of your interviews you conducted. Thank you.
To your first one, yes, I feel enormously privileged. Like, a lot of my friends are music journalists, but most of them are freelance, and it still seems harder now than ever. And like I think I was saying, like, the absolute worst thing that can happen to us at work is somebody dies and we're not prepared for it, and then it's a very stressful couple of days because you have to, do the news and everything around that. But at the end of the day, it is writing about music and having to think about music, and also sort of in those situations like honouring somebody's life. So yeah, I can't complain and do feel very privileged about it. Existentially, it probably will one day go away, but at that stage, I probably just have to remind myself that I've had a sort of long career already out of doing this, and perhaps it might be healthy to do something else one day. But obviously, I hope, the whole time I've been a music journalist, people have been saying like, it's in crisis, it's dead, and it's never died and it's never gone away, because I think like film criticism or political analysis or whatever, there is still value for it, because it's just another lens by which to see the world. And really the only way, certainly like late 20th century history, the main way I've learned about it is through whatever music was popular at that time and what it illuminates. And I think, that sort of coverage will still have value. Funny stories. My brain has gone completely dead now. I'm going to think of one, and I will answer this in a minute, because otherwise I'll just sit here staring into space for a second. But I will do my best to think of one.
I have a question about British media landscape. If you look at it, how much space is there for, as Meloš has already mentioned it, for stories about the not only maybe music industry, but cultural industry itself, and about the way it works, and about who gets to do what, and about the conditions in which people work, etc.?
I would say definitely working at The Guardian, that is probably sort of the backbone of the culture section. Like, it's nice that there's interviews with starry names and stuff like that who are in a film or whatever, but I think especially after Me Too, that sort of analysis of power structures within the industry is really important. Like, I think last week, the actor Richard E. Grant said that the most mistreated people in the film industry and television are runners, like sort of the sort of lowest denominator people on the set. And he said that, yeah, they're terribly mistreated. And then off the back of that, our community team did a call out whereby people could write in, and then that was turned into a report talking about what is the actual condition of life like for runners, and it turns out it is pretty bad. And yeah, when you talk about access, like class is a really big issue. That's definitely something that we report on. Yeah, I would say that it's really, really fundamental.
Also in other media? Or do you think, like, has it improved in the last couple of years? Or?
In culture generally, or media coverage of these issues?
Yeah, in Britain.
I think the media coverage is, sort of definitely improved. You know, there's a lot more attention and interest in concepts like intimacy coordinators, which I think was, do people know what that is? Yeah, which was, I think, not a role that was sort of widely talked about some years ago, and is now, that's like, kind of a running theme. So yeah, I think it has become a lot more important.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Emily. I'm interested in working in music touring, and I know you've written a lot about this, especially in terms of the Eras tour. So I've been thinking a lot about how expensive not only buying tickets is, but also how expensive touring is for artists themselves that often make touring not possible or very difficult to even cut even. So I'm very curious about what you found in your own research with touring and where you see the future of that going, especially in regards to Live Nation and Ticketmaster and that whole mess.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see if that antitrust hearing does manage to break them apart, because they are controlling way too much of the market. You mentioning the Eras tour, I think that is just sort of like the genie's out the bottle now in terms of how much you can charge people for tickets and the dynamic pricing thing. It's become, I think that tour made, especially post-pandemic, the idea of going to a live music event, so it's like a cultural must-have. It's like a bragging right for your Instagram, even if you're not necessarily like a big kind of like music person. And I think there is so much demand that artists really can, and Ticketmaster and Live Nation really can kind of set the terms. Like the price, Oasis are reforming and they're playing next year, and the prices for that were sort of like equally extravagant. I think the Sabrina Carpenter tour that's coming to the UK and Europe next year, there were people online really angry that it can cost up to like £325 or something for a ticket to see that. So I think, I don't know, we're in a period of acceleration and greed, and presumably it has to burst at some point, because you're a 15-year-old music fan who lives, in the regions or whatever, and your Saturday job is not going to let you save up for one of those tickets. Like, either those people get counted out forever, or it doesn't seem sustainable to me.
Thank you.
Hi, I just have a simple question regarding AI. So, how would you describe the influence of AI on music journalism, and how do you use it?
For me, the only AI I use is an automatic transcription service where you put your audio from an interview in it and it transcribes it for you. I feel very guilty for using it because I think AI is going to be really, really damaging, but it has saved me hundreds of hours of time. Otherwise, I mean, I guess it's probably coming from music journalism in terms of, like I was saying, every website, Taylor Swift does something, every website writes a news story about it. You could probably get AI to do that, and I'm sure that some places already are, and there's been evidence found of it. I don't think it will be able to do like the human job of analysis, or certainly not an interview or whatever. But then also, I know it can be a useful prompt for some people. For example, if you were going to interview, Charlie XCX or whatever, and you typed into ChatGPT, what are 10 good interview questions for Charlie XCX? One of them might be good, or one of them might give you an idea for something else. So I respect people, and especially creative people as well, who use it as a prompt just to sort of like reflect your own brain back at you and help you sort of see something different in it, perhaps.
I guess we have space like for one or two more before we wrap up.
I want to ask about your opinion maybe about influence of streaming platforms on music journalism, because maybe before that, like, if music is not good to buy or track from the internet, and now we don't have this problem, and what do you think about this?
I think that what you point out is definitely true. You it's not even try before you buy now. It's just try it and have as much as you want, and you don't ever have to pay if you don't want to, or maybe you can spend €11 a month or something on it. I think that especially Spotify, there's definitely made efforts at points to try and replace the need for music journalism by having so-called editorial curation, even though you never see, whose editorial hand is actually part of it. I guess those are potentially negative ways that it's affected it. I mean, it's as a critic, it's definitely helped me have more voracious and exploratory taste in music and listen to things that if I had to pay €10 for each of those records, it would not have been possible to sort of get into all of them.
Hi, I'm sorry this is a little bit of a different topic question, but based on your experience with artists and fans, what do you think the size of chances, or what chances are there, in your opinion, for the artists to, based on their publicly shared support or opinions, to influence the American elections?
That is a very interesting question. I've thought about this quite a lot. I think it's, you can see why it's important for the Kamala Harris campaign to have Beyonce and Taylor Swift behind her, because they are, probably aside from her, the most famous women in the world right now. I don't know how actively influential it is. I could see, I'm coming at this from the angle of being I'm in my mid-30s. Maybe if you're 18 and you're voting for the first time and you've maybe not been that politically involved before, seeing an artist that you love back, a candidate might make you think, engage with it in a particular way. I think it's also, something we saw around the Hillary Clinton presidential election attempt is that it can backfire as well, because when you have so many, as the left-wing candidate, if you have too many celebrities on your side, it becomes even easier for the right-wing to be oh look, it's the liberal elite, they're nothing like us, they're up in their ivory towers, vote for us real people, even though I'm a billionaire who's been to jail or whatever. So yeah, I think every little obviously helps, but what tangible effect it has, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Maybe now's the time for a fun story.
Oh, God. I was really struggling to think of one. Once I was interviewing the Welsh musician Kate Le Bon, who I think is brilliant, and we were walking up a mountain in California, and mid-answer, she just went, "Oh, look, a rattlesnake," really calmly, and you can hear me scream on the tape. But I'm sure there's more than that, but my brain's just a bit blank, sorry.
Yeah, I guess one quick question, and before we wrap up, if there is one. And if... Okay.
I can yell. I'd just like to know your favorite song.
It's harder than the fun story, right?
Have maybe different answers on... Oh, it's West End Girls by the Pet Shop Boys.
Wow. That we can agree on, I guess. Okay, so it was absolute pleasure to have you here in Prague and at the Institute of Communication Studies and Journalism at Charles University. Applause for Laura.